Hello, you are on the Stories by the Fireplace channel. Make yourself comfortable. Enjoy listening to it. Wow, it's cool, the 7-year-old exclaimed enthusiastically, twirling the new drone his father gave him. I agree, first class, said his nanny Amy. On a warm June morning after breakfast, businessman Richard decided to please his son Ben with a new toy. It was hard to surprise the boy with anything. He already had board games, cars in countless numbers, and various machine guns, pistols, and many other things. But as the boy was fond of different machinery, the man's choice fell on a flying drone. Richard owned a lucrative business. Respectively, there was a lot of money in the wallet, and the man could afford to pamper his son with expensive toys and things. Presented Ben quadcopter was the latest model. It had LED lights and a camera that could shoot videos of excellent quality. The size of the drone was not small and well distinguishable in the air. Together with his son, the businessman read the instructions for the drone and installed the remote control and the battery. "Daddy, let's start it up now," said Ben. "Son, I have to go to the office now. Mom has some urgent things to do too, so Emmy will help you launch the drone," said Richard. "We always have fun with her." His father nodded with a smile. For a moment, the memory of how the young babysitter had ended up in their family flashed through his mind. It had been a pure accident that had saved his son's life. On an ordinary summer afternoon, the businessman and his son were taking a stroll in the public garden of the neighborhood where they lived. Ben was lightly kicking a soccer ball rolling in front of him. He managed to slow it down with his foot to prevent it from rolling onto the roadway that passes near the square. The boy concentrated on controlling the round object until he was distracted by a meme parodying the people walking in front of him. Gazing at it, the businessman's son did not notice when his ball hit a rock and changed its trajectory, rolling straight onto the road. Ben noticed his absence when the ball rolled off the sidewalk onto the roadway. "My ball," the boy shouted. But he had only made it as far as the curb when he felt someone grab his arm and heard a woman's voice. "Stop, you're going to get hit." Dazed, Ben braked at the edge of the road, and a car rushed past him at high speed. It didn't even slow down, and drove away at the same breakneck speed. The boy somehow came to his senses, and of course, he immediately forgot about the ball. Turning away from the road, the businessman's son saw a beautiful young girl in front of him, looking at him anxiously. After a couple of seconds, Richard came running up to them, who was walking 3 meters behind his son. The fact is that the man had received a phone call from a colleague and had to deal with an urgent matter on the go. "Ben, are you okay? What happened?" He started to ask his son, hugging him first. In response, the boy only stared back at his father, then at the road, then at his savior. Then the businessman took his son by the hand and led him away from the road. "Come with us," he said to the stranger. The woman nodded and followed her father and son into the park, away from the road. There they sat down on a free bench in the shade of a tree. By this time, Ben had finally come to his senses and was looking curiously at the girl, who had prevented him from falling under the wheels of a car. "I wanted to thank you from the bottom of my heart for saving my son. Now I owe you. Since my wife is often busy at the moment, I have a business proposal for you, namely to join us as a nanny for Ben," said Richard, looking gravely at the girl sitting next to his son. After the shock of what happened by the side of the road had passed, the businessman paid attention to the stranger's attractiveness. She looked about 25 years old. Her thick, long blonde hair, which framed her pretty face and grey eyes, was gathered into a braid. But to the man, she was the one who had saved his only child from death, and besides, he loved his wife too much. "It is an interesting proposition," replied the girl. "I love children, though I have not yet had any of my own. I don't know how, but I'm good at getting along with them, so I'll take it." "So we'll be friends with her?" Ben asked his father. "Yes, son, this girl will be your nanny, and of course a friend, I hope." The businessman answered the child, "But first, let her tell you about herself. What is her name and where is she from?" "With pleasure," replied the future nanny. "My name is Amy. I was born and grew up in a small town, one might say, in the provinces. To tell you the truth, my family is not wealthy. My parents and I lived in poverty. For me, such an existence became morally unbearable. Seeing nothing but hopelessness, I moved here to the metropolis. To get out of poverty myself and help my parents. That's what I wanted. That's commendable." The businessman appreciated her actions. "Then welcome to our family. I think it's time we introduced ourselves as well. My name is Richard, and this is my son Ben." Thus a simple girl from the provinces was suddenly given the chance to realize her goal. The wealthy family treated their employee loyally and with respect. They did not allow themselves rough words, never hurt the girl, but at the same time did not carry her in their arms either. The young nanny understood that the rich people were her employers and she was their employee. The girl could not complain about the pay for her work either. Her salary was enough for her own needs and to send some of the money to her parents. "Daddy, when are Amy and I going to launch the drone?" "Now I'll call her," the businessman said, distracted from his memories, and dialed the girl's number on his cell phone. Richard and his son decided to wait for the babysitter in the yard outside the house. While waiting for Amy to arrive, Ben just ran down the street, holding the drone in his outstretched hand. The girl arrived fairly quickly, and the first thing she did was say hello and then hugged Ben. "Let's get it up and running soon. I'm so excited to see it fly." The boy jumped around the nanny. "Ben, wait a little while. We have very little room in town to launch a drone of this model. It might get stuck in a tree or on the roof of a house or fly into the road. Now our driver will take you out of town, where your drone can show off its abilities. There's the space he needs and the gorgeous views of nature. And my mother prepared this for you, so you will have something to eat during the walk." With these words, the businessman gave Amy a picnic basket with fruit, sandwiches, and tea in a thermos. "Thank you," said the nurse and turned to her ward. "Well, let's go. Let's go and see what your toy can do." He nodded happily. Amy and Ben took a seat in the back of the luxury car, placing a basket of groceries beside them. The boy waved to his father from the car window with a smile. The man responded in kind and with a calm heart went about his business in the office, knowing that his son was in good hands. On the way, Ben did not let the gift out of his hands, while talking about its merits and features. The father read all of this information to the boy on the box in the instructions, and he remembered it perfectly. The child told him so fascinatingly that Amy listened to him with genuine interest. To launch the quadcopter, Richard advised to go to a village which was 30 kilometers away from the city. According to him, there was a wonderful landscape for flying in the form of vast fields and beautiful forests. During the trip, the landscape behind the car window changed from the urban jungle in the form of various buildings and advertising bills, and pedestrian sidewalks to the suburban green plains. After letting his babysitter know everything he knew about the drone, Ben spent the rest of the drive silently admiring out the car window. Amy followed his example, and then a village loomed ahead. "Attention passengers on board," the driver said playfully. "We are almost there. Down we go. Hurrah!" The businessman's son rejoiced. The driver was looking for the right place to launch the drone for about 5 minutes. Finally, they stopped near a spacious field, behind which a birch grove could be seen. "How do you like this place?" asked the chauffeur. "It's great," the babysitter praised him. She took a picnic basket and got out of the car, inhaling deeply the rustic, floral-scented air. Ben followed, clutching a drone in his hands. "Wow, that's a lot of room. It's going to fly," the boy marveled. Amy patted him on the top of his head and walked forward. There she spotted a large stump from an old felled tree. It was perfect to use as a snack table after testing the flying machine. Setting up the drone, Ben pressed the launch button. Blue, red lights blinked, 4 powerful propellers spun, and the Wonder Machine soared into the sky. As this was the first time he had ever flown a drone, his flight was a bit jerky, and the machine occasionally jerked from side to side, but it didn't fall over. 3 times the boy launched and landed the drone quite successfully. The small screen on the drone made it possible to watch the recorded videos right away. That's what the nanny and Ben did during snack time. Deciding to launch the drone again, the boy touched the coveted start button. Only this time, trying to perform a cool maneuver, Ben turned the drone too sharply to the right and failed to control it. The drone spun and fell somewhere behind the fence in the trio's field of vision. Well, it fell, the child said sadly, and probably got lost too. What are we going to do? Don't worry, I'm sure I'll find him. It would be a shame to lose such an interesting toy, the nurse consoled the boy. She took the basket of food from the stump and led Ben to the car, then turned to the driver, waving her hand in the direction of the fence. Frank, we've got a drone down somewhere that way. Keep Ben busy for a while, and I'll go look for the machine. The driver nodded and let the businessman's son sit in the seat next to the driver's seat. The only entertainment Frank could offer the child was games or cartoons on a tablet in the car. Ben was quite happy with that. Meanwhile, Amy didn't waste a minute and went in search of a toy. On the way to the fence, behind which the flying machine crashed, the girl picked a few wildflowers. Upon reaching the spot, the nanny read the inscription on the gate. It turned out that beyond the fence was the village cemetery. The blue paint on the metal fence was frayed from sunlight and rainwater. This gave the place a certain mystique and touch of mysticism. Like any other, this resting place of departed souls had its own peculiar atmosphere and mournful silence, which could not be affected by anything from the outside world. As she entered the cemetery and closed the gate behind her, Amy looked up, remembering roughly where the drone had fallen. Determining the direction, she walked between the graves. Some were intact, and some had holes in them, like mole holes. The silence had a calming effect on the girl, and thoughts swirled in her head about how fleeting this life is and that she should treasure every moment of it. Amy couldn't help but sigh sadly, and then walked over to several of the graves on the side where the toy had fallen. 2 of them were far from new, and judging by the dates engraved on the tombstones, they were the graves of deceased old men. But the 3rd grave at the furthest end, the one closest to the thicket of bushes, was new. The name on the gravestone with a cross indicated that a boy was buried there. Judging by the data on the plaque, it was only 5 days ago. The words embossed under the date of death made it clear that the boy's grieving mother had never been able to come to terms with the loss of her son. It is understandable. It is very hard for all parents to bury their own child, especially at such a young age. 30 years old, and you would still be alive, and you're gone, whispered the nurse, approaching the low mound. When she had said these words, she put on top of it the flowers picked by the fence and added, "May the earth rest in your soul." Then, shaking her head as if she were getting rid of some obsession, Amy looked around for the drone. She noted to herself that there was a lot of grass and weeds growing in the village cemetery, and it was clear from the damp soil that it had recently rained, making the grass vegetation grow to her waist. The fact that she was not mowed down did not surprise her. She knew that cemetery workers were not very fond of all sideline work, and tried to shift all the duties of grave care onto the relatives of the deceased. This day the weather was warm enough, almost no wind, and the green leaves swayed languidly on the branches of the bushes. But, as luck would have it, the sun was at its zenith. The air was very warm, and it was unbearably hot. Everything around her seemed to be in an invisible mousse. Amy felt drops of sweat forming on the back of her neck. Pulling her backpack off her shoulder, She pulled out a paper handkerchief and wiped the moisture from her neck. It felt a little easier. "How long does it take to find a drone in this thicket?" she said thoughtfully. "But I promised I'd come back with a toy." In the minutes that Nanny had been in the cemetery, she had met no living people. Only a flock of crows flew over the trees at some distance from her. Amy stepped away from the grave with the young boy and was about to begin her search for the flying machine when suddenly a strange sound was heard somewhere nearby. She shuddered and looked around, but there was not a soul around except for a couple of sparrows perched on a willow branch. "Well, now it's too hot to see things," she muttered grudgingly to the nurse. Just taking a step toward the thicket where she thought the drone might have fallen, she heard the strange sound repeated. "No, it didn't sound at all like birds chirping," Amy said aloud. A second later, a hunch about what the unusual sound resembled from the outside struck her like an electric shock. "God, it's a human voice," she whispered. At first, she seemed paralyzed. The sound came from that very fresh grave. But the hairy hick was no coward, and so, after a short period of stupefaction, she walked back to the grave. Leaning over it, the girl listened and quite clearly distinguished a couple of phrases. "I'm alive, somebody help me." What she heard again sent Amy into shock. Of course, the girl did not think at all that the guy recently buried there could be alive. That said, she was a realist and didn't believe in ghosts either. Standing at the grave, the nanny suggested aloud, "Perhaps it is a double burial. It happens that a dead person is put another one, only a little higher." Deciding that her theory was correct, the girl took a step back from the grave and looked around, hoping to see the cemetery workers. When the sound repeated itself once more, she knew she had to act immediately and hurried to the gatehouse that had been spotted nearby. There she was met by two brothers who had worked in the funeral parlor for years. They were used to getting good money for their services, and they were never in a hurry to do anything for free. When Amy entered the gatehouse, the brothers only looked at her indifferently, and then the older one asked, "What can I get you?" "There's a dead man in the grave talking," she blurted out. "What do you mean, what dead man? What grave?" Junior asked, looking at the stranger incomprehensibly. Then the girl told the men everything from the beginning. But her story about the drone and the sounds coming from beneath the ground did not arouse much interest in them. The reason was simple. They had seen a lot in their years of work at the cemetery and were used to the fact that relatives of the deceased often made up all sorts of tall tales. Usually, in order to calm the mourners, it was enough for the brothers to take them to the grave and point to the date of death of the buried, engraved on the tombstone. Then the living would calm down little by little and leave peacefully. They wanted to do the same to Amy, but she wouldn't let up and overstepped her bounds with her insistence. Eventually, the gravediggers gave in to her pressure. After exchanging a meaningful glance with his younger brother, the older one shrugged and followed the girl, saying, "Well, let's go see your talking tomb." The nanny nodded and went first, followed by the eldest and the youngest at the back of the procession. And so all three of them reached the mysterious grave. As they approached the grave, the older cemetery worker hummed and said defiantly, "There's that grave again. It's a strange one. During the funeral, it was filmed on a video camera for some reason. So what do we do next?" Amy was not confused and advised the man, "And you lean over the grave mound and listen." The cemetery worker grimaced but followed her advice. The younger brother did the same. At first, the older of the two heard nothing, but after a minute he distinguished someone's muffled shrieks. The gravedigger turned pale, but still managed to pick himself up, and immediately took advantage of the situation to his advantage. Yes, something was heard, but what was it? Maybe rats, maybe foxes, wandering in from time to time. But that doesn't mean we have to tear up every grave at the drop of a hat. It doesn't mean we have to tear up every grave on demand. "Exactly," said the younger one. "Can you imagine what it would be like to start digging around here just like that? We'd be here day and night with shovels, and time is money. Emmy immediately understood the gravedigger's hint and said quietly, "Wait, I'll be right back." She stepped away from them at a distance and muttered to herself under her nose, "They're corrupt again." When she reached the car, where Frank and Ben were playing on a tablet, the nanny briefly told the driver about the grave. What if there really was a living person buried there? Then he needs help right away. And those two just want money, she summed up. He nodded and followed Emmy silently. She was leading Ben by the hand a little behind her, since it was impossible to leave a 7-year-old alone in the car. While waiting for the stranger, the gravedigger brothers each smoked a cigarette and stood leaning on shovels stuck in the ground. Here, the younger one noticed Emmy walking backwards and pushed the older one in the shoulder. "Look, here she comes, and who else is with her? What a chifferobe." As the trio approached the grave, Nanny pointed to the grave mound and 2 men with shovels. "Frank, this is it, but these gentlemen refused to help." The grave diggers were frightened when they noticed the muscular tall driver from a distance, but after he gave them a stern look, they immediately began digging themselves. Since the grave was fresh, it wasn't too difficult to dig, and it didn't take much time. After digging and removing the coffin from the hole, the cemetery staff opened it. They were shocked by what the adults standing next to the coffin saw. There was a boy alive in the box. He was conscious and moaning with the last of his strength. He was on the verge of physical exhaustion and dehydration. "God, we need to call an ambulance and the police right away," Emmy exclaimed and immediately began dialing the right numbers. While removing the coffin from the grave, Amy asked Frank to step aside with Ben so as not to frighten the businessman's son with what might be in there. When the ambulance and police were called, she approached the driver and the boy and told them, "Go to the car. Show the doctors and the police where to go, while I finish looking for the drone." Emmy could not believe what was happening until the last moment. Only when the law and the paramedics arrived did she accept the fact that it was all real. The first thing the paramedics did was put the young man on a stretcher. Because he was unable to say a word and didn't have any documents, they wrote his name on the cross. The doctors did not find any visible injuries on his body. There were no wounds, bruises or fractures. Rural police immediately took photographs of the scene and interviewed Emmy and the gravedigger's brothers. After the gravedigger had done all the necessary investigative work, the brothers covered the hole with soil and pulled out the headstone and cross to dispose of it. Before the services called left, Amy managed to find out from the doctors what hospital the guy in the coffin would be taken to. Then she was still able to find the drone, which had fallen into the dense bushes that grew a few yards away from the excavated grave. Back at the car, she gave the drone to a delighted Ben, and Frank asked her to stop by the local clinic before returning to town, since that was where the boy she had rescued had been taken. At the gate of the clinic, she told the driver and her ward, "Wait for me here. I just want to know how the guy from the cemetery is doing." The receptionist told her that the young man she had saved had been admitted to the intensive care unit and gave her the name of a doctor to whom she could go with any questions. Emmy sought out the doctor and, after briefly telling her who she was, asked questions about the young man's condition. The doctor replied that he was immediately given an IV and blood samples were taken. All further information will be known only after the results of the tests come in, the doctor concluded. Realizing that this was a matter of hours, Amy gave the doctor her phone number and asked him to call her as soon as she had any news about the boy's well-being. When Amy returned to town, the first thing she did was to tell Richard what had happened. "We were in a situation today you would not believe." The girl didn't leave out a single detail, even gave the last name of the guy who was on the cross. She remembered them very well. "Brown Robert," the pale rich man said when he heard the last name. "I know the man in absentia. He's a businessman too, and he's quite alive and well. I saw him just the other day when I left on a business trip. He seemed to be buying plane tickets, and he was doing it in a hurry. It is unlikely that the same person could be in the grave and at the ticket counter at the same time. Who did I find in the cemetery and in the village? Said the nurse in another shock. Alas, I do not know, her employer replied. Only the boy can answer this question when he wakes up. Realizing that in any case she would not be able to do anything or find out anything yet, the girl spent a couple more hours with the businessman's son and then went home. The next day was Amy's day off, so she decided to pay a visit to the rural hospital. When she arrived at the place, she found the boy's attending doctor. "Hello, I wanted to know about Brown Robert's condition," she said. "I can tell you the good news, he's awake. Only it turns out his name isn't Brown Robert," the doctor replied. "Well, what is it then?" "Robinson Kevin. You know what's strange? Our experts found faint traces in his blood of a highly potent poison, which has a paralytic effect. And I can also tell you that there was no proper autopsy on this guy. And in fact, the burial itself was carried out in violation of all the procedural norms. Apparently, someone wanted to get rid of the guy very badly to cover up the use of the poison." "What room is Kevin in now?" "He's already been moved from the ICU to room 209. It's on the second floor to the right of the stairs. It's visiting hours, so you can go up and see him." "Thank you. That's exactly what I'll do." Amy thanked the doctor and headed for the stairs. Finding the right room, she knocked and went in. The room was designed for 3 patients, but at the moment no one but a young man was there. He, noticing the stranger who entered, quietly asked, "Hi, who are you?" "Hi, my name is Amy. Thanks to me you are here now, and not in the tomb of the village cemetery," said the girl. The boy was still weak, and his reaction was not quick. The first thing he did was thank his babysitter for his rescue as she sat down in the chair next to the bed. Amy nodded her head and asked, "Do you even remember what happened to you? How you ended up in that coffin?" The boy closed his eyes for a second, and then he pulled himself up in bed, leaning on his elbow, and took a semi-seated position. "I don't know what happened to me. The last name on the cross is not mine. I've been Robinson Kevin for 30 years, not some Brown Robert. And I'm not a politician, nor am I a financial whiz to get back at me for something or anything like that. I'm just an ordinary longshoreman. It looks like I've been drugged with something," replied the boy. "With what and how?" said the girl thoughtfully. "I don't know what it was, but I met a girl in the evening, and I was just finishing my shift. She suggested we go to a cafe and have a cup of coffee. I, being single, had some free time, so I agreed. That's the last thing I remember, nothing else. Then I woke up in a coffin with makeup on my face, feeling it with my fingers. Of course, I began to call for help, although I had almost no strength," concluded the story of the young man. "How so?" The young nurse shook her head. "You can't have one man shoved into a coffin and buried alive for no reason. Did you tell the police that, about the girl, that you were drugged?" Kevin shook his head in response. "No, I didn't. I don't like them, cops. I've been on probation in the past, and it was for nothing. I haven't had a soft spot for them since. That's your business, of course, but I won't rest until I know what's what in this case," Amy promised the boy and herself. "It's not every day I save people from the grave. How long will they keep you here?" "About a week," the young man answered, "and then they'll let you go home to the city." "Great, I think we'll see you again," said Amy with a smile. "Sure," Kevin replied, smiling too, "if I know how to reach you." Without objection, Nanny took a notebook out of her backpack and, tearing out a piece of paper, wrote her name and phone number on it, then put it on the nightstand next to the bed. Get well soon. When the door closed behind the girl, the young man noted to himself that he liked this grey-eyed savior. Why not start with friendship? The boy said aloud, taking a piece of paper with Amy's name and phone number in his hands. On her next workday, The girl decided not to pull the cat by the tail and start her own investigation, asking her employer for help. Richard, however, asked the nanny to wait until the evening because he had urgent work matters that could not wait. The girl nodded understandingly and went to attend to her ward. "Today I propose not to stay at home and go to the cinema," said Amy to the boy. "Oh, goody." Ben got excited. "Then put your feet in your hands and let's go," clapped the babysitter's hands together. "I'll get Frank." In the first half of the day, there were few visitors to the movie theater, so tickets to the cartoon were bought without any problems. After the hour-and-a-half show, it was decided to take a walk in the square next to the movie theater. After eating one last popsicle, Amy and Ben got into the car, and the businessman's driver drove them home. Richard, however, had not yet returned from work, so the nanny took Ben to paint. An hour later, the owner came in. His workday was over for the day, so he could let Amy go home. Before she went, she asked the man, "Do you happen to know someone at the police department?" He wondered, "What do you want from the police, you know?" "I want to know about the last name that was written on the cross, and also why that guy was wanted killed and buried under someone else's name. I don't believe it could have just been a prank or something." "Well, I can't say no to you. After all, you saved my son not long ago, and I don't forget good deeds," said Richard. "Yes, I know someone in the police. I will put you in touch with the right person who can help you. I will call him now and arrange a meeting with him. All you have to do is show up at the station on the appointed day to see that man. Say it's from me, and you won't have a problem." Without delaying the matter, the businessman dialed the number of his acquaintance in front of Amy. Seeing the girl's impatience, the man arranged for him to see her tomorrow. "Thank you," the nanny said with a smile in response. Richard only nodded quietly. Amy went home with a feeling of inner satisfaction. Spending the evening in front of the TV watching her favorite sci-fi series, the girl mentally prepared for tomorrow's conversation with the police, as such events with the burial and the rescue of a person from it happened to her for the first time. The excitement periodically surged in the young provincial girl. But then the next morning came, and the nanny, throwing her backpack behind her back, went to the city police station. At the entrance, she was met by the officer on duty. "Who are you and what is your business?" he asked. "My name is Amy Smith. I have an appointment with Alan King." The man on duty immediately dialed an extension number to contact the person the nanny came to see. After a minute, he hung up and looked at the girl and said, "Come in, turn right at the turnstile, then straight down the corridor to office number 15. They're waiting for you." "Thank you," thanked Amy and walked in the direction of the office she had been told. Once inside, she met the middle-aged man sitting at the desk. "Hello, my name is Amy. I am from Richard," she said. Yes, I am aware of that," replied the representative of the law with a smile. "Richard asked me to help you in any way he could in return for the good deed you asked for. So sit down and let's begin." After Amy sat down across from him, he turned to her again. "Now, what exactly do you need my help with?" The young nanny briefly recounted the gist of what had happened to her, omitting trivialities and focusing on important details. "The story of the racketeer's dead man is commonplace. The guy's lucky you were there. I will, of course, make inquiries about the man you are interested in through my channels, but you must be prepared for it to take a day," the policeman warned. "I understand that in any case, until I find out why Kevin was put in the grave, I won't be able to rest easy. Imagine yourself in his shoes," Nanny Ben said, looking into Alan's unfazed eyes. Despite the fact that the man's eyes remained serious, the girl caught a glimmer of sincere participation in the situation. The lawman stood up from his chair and held out his hand to Amy. She did the same in return. After the handshake, the policeman said, "I will do everything in my power to resolve your question, dear young lady. There's no way you won't be in the dark." Thanking Alan, She left the office and, having closed it, sighed with relief, knowing full well that she could only wait for news from the investigator. Amy had her full attention on her work. The good news was that Dmitri was soon to be discharged from the hospital. The father of the girl's 7-year-old ward didn't stay away either, promising to ask about Brown Robert in his circles, as he himself knew too little about him. So the girl wondered which of these things would happen, whether she would be contacted by a policeman sooner, or Kevin would be discharged, or whether she would get information from the businessman. The boy she had rescued was the first to make himself known. Amy was just finishing a nightly cup of herbal tea to begin the process of preparing for bed. She reached for her cell phone to put it on airplane mode when it rang. An unfamiliar number popped up on the screen. Who could it be at this hour? Nanny muttered and touched the call button. Yes, go ahead. Hello from the other side of the world. The voice on the phone said jokingly, I think you recognize me, and there's no need to introduce yourself. The sleep vanished from Amy and was replaced by a burst of vivacity. Of course I did, she said cheerfully. How are you feeling? When will you be home? And I was discharged yesterday, so I'm already in town. I suggest we meet tomorrow. Do you like ice cream? Kevin asked. I love ice cream, answered the nanny. Only tomorrow afternoon I work and will be free in the evening. But that's okay. I know the perfect place to meet. You'll love it. See you tomorrow, the guy said and hung up. As he did so, Amy felt as if an unseen interlocutor had winked at her. Giggling, the girl finally went to bed. The next morning, the babysitter came to work with obvious enthusiasm. This did not escape the attention of her employer. Won at least $1 billion in the lottery. The businessman asked with a smile. What? No, why should I? The girl did not understand. I just see that today you are in a mood of 5 and $1 billion plus. It means that something happened, Richard explained inspiringly. Amy was embarrassed for a second, then briefly explained. The guy I rescued called yesterday and said he's already home, and we're going to see him tonight. That's great. The man smiled. First a job, then a date. By the way, I have some information about the man whose name was on the cross in the village cemetery. The nanny immediately turned all aloud, catching every word of her employer. I asked around in my circle, and they told me this. It turns out that Brown Robert was a mediocre businessman, a small fish, so to speak. He owned several outlets selling parts and supplies for foreign cars. He was often seen in the company of women, and always different ones. But lately he had been seen with the same girl, much younger than himself. That's all I could find out. I think a lot of new information on this case will come from Alan from the police. The man looked at his large dial wristwatch and added, and now you and Ben should go to soccer practice. On your return from there, you will have to teach him to read and draw. She nodded briefly, taking the hand of the boy who had run up to her, and they left the house together. The day flew by while they were running errands. After wishing her ward and his parents a good evening, Amy went to meet Kevin at the place they had agreed upon. He was already waiting for her outside the ice cream parlor. When she spotted the boy, she slowed down to examine him. The young man had a lean figure. He couldn't be called short, and his dark hair was cut short. As she got quite close, the girl was able to look into his brown eyes. After saying hello, the young men entered the cafe and settled at a table away from the entrance. First, they discussed what had happened with Kevin. Then the nanny shared what she had learned from her employer. After that, the couple moved on to talking about everyday things. It was getting dark outside, and the evening lights were on when the young people left the cafe. Amy couldn't resist taking a few pictures together in front of the building. She felt in her heart that she would meet Dmitri again. Exhausted for the day, Amy fell asleep as soon as her head touched the pillow. The last person to slip her some solid information about Brown Robert was a policeman she knew, Richard. He called the girl the next morning. The nanny was just beginning to get ready for work when she heard the cell phone on her bedside table jangling. When she picked up the phone, she heard an invariably serious male voice. "Amy Smith, hello. Would you like to know something interesting about your case with that grave? Then come right now, if you have a few minutes to spare." Quickly turning her gaze to the clock that hung in front of her sleeper, she answered, "Yes, I have some free time before I have to show up at Richard's." Before she knew it, she had reached the police station. She was anxious to find out the solution to the mystery of Brown Robert. The officer on duty was alerted to her visit and let the nanny pass without any questions. Amy remembered the office number and where it was, so just a minute later she was sitting across from Alan. Then she told the man what she had learned from her employer, and then what Kevin had told her about meeting the girl who had offered him coffee together. The law representative immediately asked, "Did this young man remember her appearance? He could give a description for the sketch." "I think so. In his conversations with me, he mentioned in passing that he could recognize her," the girl replied. "Then it makes things easier. I'll share with you what I learned through my channels, and you'll understand why the sketch of the girl who drugged Kevin," began the representative of the law. Amy froze in her chair, prepared to listen. Before he continued, the policeman poured himself and her a glass of water from the cooler next to his desk. Finally, he spoke. "So, I made some inquiries and found out a lot of interesting things. It turns out that the man whose name was on the cross was missing. No one had seen him for days. It was as if the man had simply vanished. I was suspicious, so I checked his credit history. It turned out that before he disappeared, he had taken out a huge loan from the bank. And this is what this most ill-fated businessman looks like." With these words, Alan turned the monitor so that the girl could see the picture on it. Looking at the picture, Amy groaned and pulled out her cell phone. Opening one of the pictures she had taken with Kevin earlier, she put it in front of the policeman. He saw the picture and nodded meaningfully, while still remaining calm. Then he handed the phone back to her and said, "Yeah, the resemblance to the guy who almost got buried alive is striking. A little makeup, and Kevin easily becomes a Robert Brown lookalike." "Makeup," exclaimed the nurse. "He told me he woke up and felt the makeup on his face with his fingers. But I can't yet figure out how all these factors are interrelated. Pretty girl, there's a clear scam going on here, and your Kevin didn't get into this mess by accident." Apparently, that negligent businessman wanted to kill the guy and bury him in his place. It seems that he brought his mistress as an accomplice, and the grave was videotaped for the collectors, because this Robert Brown was not going to pay back the money he had borrowed. However, they miscalculated the dose of poison, which is why Kevin woke up in a coffin. If it had been any bigger, the guy would be dead. The policeman finished the story. "But that seems to be your guess. There's no proof, and you can't bring in the culprits either, because you don't know where else to find them," said the nurse, with bitterness in her voice. "That's why the description of this Robert's mistress would be very helpful. Since his trail is lost, it might be possible to trace him through her," said the officer of the law. These words gave hope to Amy that all was not lost and justice would be served. Nodding, she said, "You will have this sketch." That was the end of the conversation, and the girl hurried off to work. That same evening, she wanted to arrange a visit to the police with Kevin, but remembering his words about his lack of warm feelings for people in uniform, she decided not to press on. This was a point she broached during their next outing. Of course, the suggestion to go to the station to make a sketch of the loser businessman's accomplice was met with a hostile response. For a good hour, the nanny persuaded the boy to overcome his fears so that the perpetrators could be found and punished. Eventually, the young man gave in. "All right, yours is taken, but only on the condition that you stay close to me." In order to compile a sketch, Oleg V. escorted the young men to an employee who, according to Kevin, drew a clear portrait of Robert Brown's mistress. Pretty soon their faces were all over the TV channels. These two are far from professionals, moreover, very careless in their actions. Sooner or later one of them will make a mistake, and that's when we'll arrest them," said the policeman. This was the babysitter's last visit to the station. Neither Emmy nor Kevin could influence the outcome of the investigation. It remained to be hoped that the sketch of the failed con artist would do the trick. Soon, the young people's lives returned to normal. Emmy was still working for Richard. Kevin was able to return to his old job as a longshoreman. In a short time, the two became almost inseparable. The girl herself did not notice how she fell in love with the man she had pulled almost out of the other world. She was sure Kevin felt the same way about her. He did. The boy had promised himself not to rush things and get to know each other better first. The events at the village cemetery and afterward paled into insignificance, replaced by pleasant memories of time spent together. The friendship between Kevin and Amy, which had begun so strangely and unexpectedly, gradually developed into a pure and bright love that grew stronger by the day. On the evening of the day off, the girl was sitting at home in a cozy chair, enjoying the candy Kevin had given her. On the box, in sloppy black marker handwriting, she wrote a brief "with love." The inscription was topped by a heart, simple though it was, but from the heart. Having eaten one more candy, Amy closed the box. Suddenly, the thought flashed through her head that it would be interesting to know how the investigation ended, whether he was found, or whether the search was still going on, and all that sort of thing. She brushed her teeth and ducked under the blanket, quickly dismissing the irrelevant thought. However, higher powers as if heard her unspoken question, the answer to which was already ready. Upon arriving at her ward in the morning, Emmy listened to Nadia's instructions, after which Richard handed the girl a flash drive and said sternly, "There are 2 videos here. Alan gave them to me under great responsibility. This is a copy of the interrogations of the very Robert Brown and his date. You can watch them on your own time, then give me back the flash drive so I can erase the tapes. Is that clear?" Of course, the babysitter also replied seriously. By the law of meanness, the day dragged on like a turtle crawling through the sand in the desert, and it was because these videos were supposed to end her investigation, and she wanted to see them as soon as possible. After running all the errands her employer had given her, the girl literally flew home, kicked off her street shoes, and inserted the flash drive into the computer system unit. It really had 2 files on it. After a second, the nanny of the businessman's son turned on the first of them. It turned out to be the interrogation process of the very man who had disappeared, or rather, escaped from the city Robert. Without moving, she looked at the monitor and saw the man sitting in front of the interrogator, denying everything to the last minute and denying his guilt. He realized he couldn't get away with it until he found out his mistress couldn't take it anymore and told her everything during the interrogation earlier. He had no choice but to confess, and it was not long in coming. He ruffled his hair and began to speak. "It's all because of her, because of Sabrina. I can't say that my business went without a hitch. Yes, there were problems, but I stayed afloat and could afford to go out. I'm a single man, and I don't see anything wrong with not being attached to one woman. And then I met Sabrina, that devil woman. It was like my mind went blank. I was doing everything for her financially, and she wasn't shy about taking. So I quickly went broke and became bankrupt. That's when the credit scam and my supposed death came to a head, and it was such a mistake with the dosage." This video ended with Robert Brown signing a paper confession and taking him into custody. The second video showed the businessman's girlfriend in the interrogation room. It was obvious from her condition that the girl was nervous and would break down pretty quickly. And so it happened. Finally smearing the remnants of makeup over her face, she gibbered, "I met Robert by chance. Well, I liked him. What's the big deal? Handsome man, not even old yet. And he's single with money. It's a shame to miss him. How could I have known he'd be so crazy with emotion? and I wasn't going to marry him. Everything was fine for a while, and then his business went dead. He couldn't think of anything better to do than take out a loan, but he couldn't pay me back. So I came up with the fake death idea. I found a guy who looked like an outsider who could be a scapegoat, who would be easy to get drunk and make up. Yeah, I videotaped the grave. It was a way to get the collectors off my back. Here was the grave. Here was the name and date of death. The plan was perfect if that idiot hadn't messed up with the poison. Having blurted it all out in the same breath, Sabrina stopped talking and just glared at the table. Then she was taken away and the recording turned off. Nanny took the flash drive out and immediately put it in her backpack, so she wouldn't forget to give it to Richard. Many different thoughts raced through her head before sleep finally overtook her. On the one hand, she felt sorry for young Sabrina, but on the other she judged her. She was only taking advantage of Robert while he had money. Amy didn't understand how anyone could think of burying an innocent man in the ground without even blinking an eye. The maelstrom of thoughts ended when Nanny Ben saw Kevin's face in front of her, his charming smile, and remembered the feeling of happiness she had felt when she was near him. Eventually, the cemetery story was forgotten. Amy and Ben drove to those places more than once to launch the drone. Only after the experience, they chose an area closer to the village. The boy was getting better and better at flying the drone, so the drone never fell down again. In that village, the businessman's son made friends with several boys, which turned simple outings into picnics. It took a few months before Kevin suggested to his savior the idea of living together. How would you like to move on to the next stage of our relationship? He asked the girl one day after visiting a movie theater. What's that? She wondered. Move in with me. The apartment is not rented, it's my own. There's enough room for the two of us. That's a tempting offer. Then I could rent out my apartment so it wouldn't be empty. After 3 months of living side by side in the same apartment, the young people have never regretted this step in their lives for a second. Since they both worked and were not with each other 24/7, they missed each other in the evening. On Friday night, over a cup of tea, Kevin somehow looked at Amy conspiratorially, winked at her and said, "And I have a surprise for you tomorrow, so get ready." Curious to the core, she smiled. It was Saturday, and the young man took her to a cafe. The price tag was not a restaurant, but it was not a diner, like a bistro or a canteen. They each had a light vegetable salad, dessert, and coffee and cream. When Amy took her last sip of her drink and placed her empty cup on the table, Kevin said, "Now close your eyes and stretch out your arms." Following the young man's instructions, she tensed involuntarily. She felt Kevin put a round object on her finger. "That's it, you can open it," she heard his warm voice. When she opened her eyes and looked at her palm, she saw that she had a silver engagement ring on her finger. Kevin looked directly at her and asked, "Will you marry me?" "Yes," replied the girl. He gave Amy his signature disarming smile, and her cheeks instantly flushed. Preparations for the wedding began the very next day. Still a modest provincial at heart, the girl planned a quiet wedding, though she dreamed of a grand ceremony. Richard, however, offered to help Nanny both financially and in choosing a good church for the wedding. He reasoned that her introduction to Kevin was not exactly conventional. Plus, his spouse and himself liked to attend various banquets and celebrations. Plus, the money side is not an issue for him. So the young people's wedding was well attended. A wedding ceremony, a white wedding dress with veil, a banquet, congratulations. This is how the girl imagined the beginning of marriage in her dreams. She was happy that her goal, which she had set for herself a long time ago, had come true. After all, in the megalopolis, she was able not only to get out of poverty, but also to meet her other half. The businessman gave his employee a vacation for her honeymoon. The newlyweds spent it in Turkey. There they literally disconnected from the outside world and enjoyed only rest and each other. Emmy was fingering necklaces made of sea stones and pearls, bought in a costume jewelry store. Turning down the volume on the television, she decided to voice an idea that had occurred to her when she returned from vacation. "You know, I've been thinking about this. Since I love my job and I'm great with kids, why not go on to be a one-child nanny? What if I opened my own developmental center for the kids? That would be so much fun. I could do creative activities with them, make crafts, go to different activities." The idea is great, but the question is, where would you get that kind of startup capital, and could you do it? Kevin rubbed his chin. "I think financially, you could go to my mentee's father. As a businessman, he's likely to appreciate the investment. I should be able to do it. I will find helpers. I already have one, and he's sitting right next to me. I'm afraid I'm only good for you as a rough laborer. I'd rather be a laborer. In any case, I fully support your idea." As Emmy suggested, Richard agreed to be an investor in her idea. He thought it was a promising and useful project. With his help, things went quite quickly, and the nanny realized what she had planned. More than once the girl caught herself thinking that if she had not saved Ben, then none of this would have happened. Or maybe it would have happened differently, but she wouldn't have traded her happiness for anything. Thank you for watching to the end. If you liked the story, I hope for your support. Face up button. Thank you and best wishes. By the way, if this isn't the first time you've listened to my stories, but for some reason you haven't signed up yet, I suggest you fix that. Just click one button, subscribe, so you and I don't get lost. I wish you health and longevity.